Good morning and welcome to our special coverage of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I'm Ladi Akiridulwale. The headlines. Delegations from Russia and Ukraine arrive in Istanbul for the first face-to-face talks in more than 2 weeks. Dramatic U-turn as U.S. President Joe Biden says he won't walk back his controversial comment that Vladimir Putin cannot remain in power. And Ukrainian foreign minister says don't eat or drink when negotiating with Russia as Chelsea owner Roman Abramovich is hit by suspected poisoning. We start off in Istanbul, Turkey, where Ukrainian and Russian delegations have arrived for peace talks with their Russian counterparts. Ukraine's delegation is led by Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov, as well as Mikhail Podolyak, the head of the president's office. The group says its top priority is to secure a ceasefire, although there's skepticism about whether this is likely. The face-to-face talks, the first in more than 2 weeks, will be hosted by Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. In the meantime, President Erdogan says both Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky and Russia's Vladimir Putin are, quote, valuable friends, as he sets the scene for talks this morning. He says progress at the talks would pave the way for the leaders to meet and that Turkey could host that too. He also tells the Russian and Ukrainian teams that both sides have, quote, legitimate concerns, but that they had reached a moment when talks need to yield concrete results. Among other things, Russia is demanding that Ukraine abandon any intention of joining NATO, an issue Ukrainian President Zelensky said he is willing to compromise on. Other thorny issues expected to be discussed include the fate of separatist-held regions in Ukraine's east, as well as the status of Crimea, which was formerly annexed by Russia in 2014. In a separate development, U.S. President Joe Biden has said that his remarks in Warsaw, Poland, that Russian President Vladimir Putin should not remain in power reflected his own moral outrage, not an administration policy shift. According to Mr. Biden, he was expressing moral outrage and he made no apologies. At the end of the speech in the Polish capital, Mr. Biden had added an unscripted line saying that Putin could not remain in power. Administration officials rushed to clarify afterwards that the White House was not advocating for regime change in Russia.
Number one, I'm not walking anything back. The fact of the matter is I was expressing the moral outrage I felt toward the way Putin is dealing and the actions of this man, just brutality. Half the children in Ukraine. I just come from being with those families. But I want to make it clear, I wasn't then, nor am I now, articulating a policy change. I was expressing the moral outrage that I feel, and I make no apologies for it.
Personal feelings, sir. Your personal feelings?
My personal feelings. The second quarter of the 21st century, once again facing increased competition from other nation states.
Tell me why. You have so much experience. You are the leader of this country.
Because it's ridiculous. Nobody believes we're going to take down, I was talking about taking down Putin. Nobody believes that. Number one. Number two, what have I been talking about since this all began? The only war that's worse than one intended is one that's unintended. The last thing I want to do is engage in a land war or a nuclear war with Russia. Given his recent behavior, people should understand that he is going to do what he thinks he should do, period. He's not affected by anybody else, including, unfortunately, apparently his own advisors.
And Ukrainian soldiers have been patrolling territory recently recaptured from Russian forces in the northeastern part of the Kiev region, passing through a landscape scarred by heavy fighting. Several wrecked Russian tanks lay scattered throughout the area next to destroyed buildings and the ruins of a church. The Ukrainian soldiers on patrol paused to bury the charred remains of a dead combatant. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said that although Ukrainian forces have regained control over some areas in the Kiev region, the fighting there was ongoing. The more than 1 month-long invasion, the biggest of a Western nation since World War II, has seen over 3.8 million people flee abroad left thousands dead or injured and brought the isolation of Russia's economy. Russia calls its actions in Ukraine a special military operation to disarm and denazify its neighbor. And Russia is reiterating its stance on the use of chemical weapons. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov told PBS in an interview that Russia would resort to nuclear weapons only in the case of a threat to the existence of his country and not as a result of the current conflict with Ukraine. Mr. Peskov says Russia has a security concept that very clearly states that only when there is a threat for existence of the state, that's when nuclear weapons can be used to eliminate that threat.
But any outcome of the operation, of course, is not a reason for usage of a nuclear weapon. We have a security concept that very clearly states that only when there is a threat for existence of the state in our country, we can use, and we will actually use nuclear weapons to eliminate the threat for the existence of our country. Let's keep all this, let's keep these two things separate. I mean, existence of the state and special military operation in Ukraine. They have nothing to do with each other.
And it's fair that Russian President Putin could use nuclear weapons in his war against Ukraine. A Nobel Peace Prize winning activist is warning that the threat will never be eliminated unless the world denuclearizes. Beatrice Finn, Executive Director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons based in Geneva, Switzerland, says the world has put itself in this situation by allowing these weapons to remain. ICAN is a coalition of 468 grassroots non-governmental groups that campaigned for a UN treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. It was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. Mr. Putin had raised alarm last month when he ordered Russia's nuclear forces to be put on high alert after invading Ukraine. Let's talk about the peace talks we mentioned at the start of the program. Joining us is Voice of America correspondent Dorian Jones. Dorian Jones is in Istanbul, Turkey. Welcome, Dorian. Thanks for joining the program.
Good morning.
Now, what can you tell us about these talks as they are today? We understand both delegations, the Russians and the Ukrainians, have in fact arrived. And where are we at the moment?
Well, as we speak, these negotiations have started between the Russian and Ukrainian delegations. They flew in late last night, an indication this is very much a last-minute affair. In fact, the agreement to meet in Istanbul only followed a conversation between the Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin. President Erdogan addressed the delegations before the start of talks this morning, saying that in peace there are no losers. But he did indicate that this is a very difficult negotiations that lay ahead of today's talks, pointing out that there are big differences, but at the same time saying that peace has to be the goal. It has to be said, though, both sides really are offering any high expectations of any major breakthrough, given that there are huge differences between the two sides. There is possible hope that some humanitarian relief can be agreed as a step in a wider process, but at the moment, expectations are pretty low.
Well, President Erdogan is personally involved in these talks, unlike the ones that had taken place earlier. And as we have been reporting, he has a fairly good relationship with both sides, particularly with the Russians, it does appear. So is it possible to assume that his involvement in this round of talks, and because they are face-to-face, we could reasonably expect that the outcome might be different from those that had taken place earlier?
I think that is a bit of a stretch. I mean, there is a sign that possible the fact that the talks have been held in Istanbul as opposed to the previous talks, which are held in Belarus, which is a country that is seen as very close to Russia, and Ukraine have been very uneasy about holding talks there. They wanted a neutral place, and Turkey is seen as neutral, given the fact that the Turkish president does have very good relations with both the Ukrainian and the Russian president. In many ways, Turkey has been trying to present itself as possibly in a unique position to offer the opportunity of a breakthrough. But the reality is that there are such big differences between the two sides. Russia calling for the neutralization, neutrality of Ukraine, and also the recognition of breakaway states in Ukraine as to be recognized internationally. That is totally unacceptable to Ukraine. Ukraine says its territorial integrity is not going to be negotiated. So there are big differences still, and I don't think anyone's expecting any change there. I mean, what they hope is that possibly these talks can start a process where they can start to lay the groundwork for an ultimate meeting between the Ukrainian and Russian presidents. And I think all sides recognize that only when those two leaders sit down together at a table is there any realistic hope of an end to this conflict. The Russians have ruled that out at the moment, saying there's no point in talking unless there is something tangible that we can agree on. And there is a recognition that that isn't where we are at the moment. But the idea of these talks is to get to that point where they can bring the two leaders together. I think also Ukraine will be looking for, like I said, some humanitarian concessions, the opening up of besieged cities to allow civilians to leave these cities in safety. Possible also a ceasefire Ukraine is calling for. But at the moment, Russians don't appear to be very interested in that. And that is an indication that there's still a long way to go before an end to this conflict is in sight.
Well, there's one of the big concessions, one of the issues that you talked there about, that there's a big gulf between both sides, is the issue of Ukraine joining NATO and guarantees that Russia wants that it will not go down that line. During the course of this week and sometime last week, the Ukrainian president seemed to indicate some flexibility on that matter, that he would be willing to discuss that. Would this have any impact, do you think, on what is possible now, if at least on that subject there is some move forward?
Well, I think certainly that was seen to be as a possible sign that the gap between the two sides could be narrowing. You're right that Ukraine has been pressing to join NATO. They see that as its ultimate guarantee of security against Russia. And Russia has said that that is one of the reasons why it is intervening, because it doesn't want NATO on its border. But having said that, the Ukrainian president has indicated they could be open to the idea of neutrality, putting aside its NATO membership aspirations. But one key demand in exchange for that concession that Ukraine is demanding is security guarantees, guarantees of that Ukraine would be protected if Russia was to ever intervene again. Now, given the fact who could give such concessions, who would risk a possible ultimate confrontation with Russia? Russia is a nuclear power, is the big question. And the only countries that you can consider would be the United States or NATO itself. And it's far from clear whether any of these countries or organizations are prepared to risk a war with Russia in the future. And that in exchange for giving guarantees of safety to Ukraine. So in many ways, this concession by Ukraine isn't seen as such a huge step forward. It's more a sign of goodwill. But again, unless there is a gap, a bridge of trust that is resolved between these, and there are some sorts of frameworks of security of both sides, both Ukraine and Russia can feel secure, then there isn't really any hope of peace or an end to this conflict. And many observers are also pointing out that is Russia really sincere in these talks? It's possibly a sign that Russia is taking part in these talks just to alleviate the growing international sanctions it's facing and the threat of further sanctions. And Russia's hoping that if it appears at these talks, then further sanctions may be put aside. So there's a lot of questions about how sincere Russia is in these talks as well, because no one really knows what Russia ultimately wants. It seems quite ambiguous about that. So there's like I said, the expectations are pretty low. But having said that, the fact that the people are meeting for talks in a neutral venue is in many ways seen as positive, and that was the message of President Erdogan today. At least people are talking, and that can't be a bad thing.
President, that's the U.S. president now, Joe Biden. So much has been made about his comments in Warsaw, Poland, and I just wonder if those comments calling President Putin a butcher, and of course the part where he talked about the fact that Putin cannot remain in power and sparking a huge debate about regime change possible regime change as a U.S. policy for Russia. Do you think that complicates this kind of talks and the question of guarantees, security guarantees that Ukraine wants and that only the United States can give, especially if the person on the other side is Russia? Do you think that plays any role in this kind of talks and the fact that maybe that could complicate things for the two presidents if and when the idea that the two of them should sit down is muted?
Well, I don't think, I think that the international reaction, and even from diplomatic reaction is across Europe, it doesn't really help when the idea is that you're trying to reduce tensions, at least the risk of a further spreading of the conflict beyond Ukraine to NATO partners, which is seen as the Armageddon, the ultimate nightmare solution, given the fact that these are all NATO nuclear powers. So I don't think that it particularly helps. But does it change things particularly on the ground? I don't think so. I think Moscow will undoubtedly be using this to bolster its position, certainly among domestically. You can be sure that those comments of President Biden will be broadcast across Russian TV, saying, look, this is the existential threat that we are facing. This is the reason why we have to take such drastic actions in places like Ukraine, because we are facing this threat from the world's most powerful country. Now, that will be used domestically, but does it change things on the beyond that? Probably not that much. And I think Moscow will see that as a misstep by Biden, which they will exploit. But will it change the outcome of the conflict in Ukraine and Russia? Probably not. It just complicates things a little bit. But the ultimate problem is trying to find some basis of trust between these two sides, and that is a long way off. And I think that many ways that the fighting on the ground will have to continue to a point where neither side believes it can win, or the cost of victory will be too high, and the diplomatic peaceful solution is the preference rather than fighting. And I don't think neither side has reached that point at the moment. So I think the expectation is that this conflict will go on for some time. It's becoming a deadly war of attrition, and the feeling is that these talks, possibly, like I said, will be hope that they can offer some humanitarian relief, which possibly could lead to further steps of trust further down the road between the two sides. But that's a long way off. I think that all that they can hope from today's talks is that they will agree to meet again, and possibly step by step bring a point where the Russian and Ukrainian presidents will meet. But there's little hope of that is anytime soon.
Before I let you go, I must ask, I mean, the initial reports about this meeting talked about 2 days. Now, the meeting has, in fact, quite started. So when you think there is an indication, or there will be an indication, that the talks are making progress, if altogether not succeeding, would that be, for example, if they went on into the second day, that would mean that there's something being discussed that both sides are interested in concluding? Or do we just take it that both sides are going to discuss and each side is going to go back, and only when they go back do we get to know what it was that came out? And if so, what role is Turkey playing in the talks themselves?
I think, yes, I think that would be a good way of reading it. The expectation, I mean, the talks were initially going to be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, but they were delayed until started today. And now I think, at least initially, it appears the expectation that they will only last a day. But if they continue into the evening, if they continue to another day, then yes, the more talks is seen as a positive thing. It means that they have something to talk about, and it's worth them sitting down and talking. But I think that also, I think the fact is that the people meeting here are quite low level compared to, they're not the foreign ministers. These are seen broadly as presidential advisors. There are people that they need to report back. They don't, from what we understand, don't have real position of power to make absolute commitments or concessions on either side. It's more basically listening to what the other side says and finding out, is there a possible way of compromise further down the road? So they will probably go back. And if there's further talks scheduled, say in a week's time or something like that, that would be seen as positive. I think the idea is that you need to start this as a process of talks, and I think that if a process does start, and if Turkey has said it's ready to do this. In fact, President Erdogan, when speaking, appeared to indicate that Turkey isn't playing a mediating role at the moment. He said we are ready to do that at any moment, but we're quite happy at the moment just to provide a place to meet and Beyond that, I don't think Turkey is playing any other role, and President Erdogan did indicate that. But Turkey is ready to do that and believes it is probably uniquely placed geographically, and the fact that it is seen as an honest broker on both sides, and as well as Turkey being a NATO member as well. So I think Turkey is ready to be in that position, but no one is really calling upon those services as of yet. And I think the hope will be that at least that this meeting will lead to another meeting being agreed at a week's time, possibly, or a couple of weeks' time. That would be seen as something positive, and that there is a process beginning. But beyond that, I don't think anyone has higher hopes.
All right, then. Thank you so much for this update. Dorit joins us from Istanbul in Turkey. We'll be coming back to you if there are any updates on these talks, and if, as so many people around the world are hoping, there are breakthroughs in them. Thank you so much at this time.
You're welcome.
We'll take a break now. When we come back, we'll be talking more about the security challenges posed by this war. Please stay on with us. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. More than 1,000 people were evacuated from humanitarian corridors in Ukraine overnight. According to the deputy head of the president's office, Krylo Timoshenko, a total of 1,099 people were evacuated, including 586 who left the besieged port city of Mariupol by car, and 513 who were evacuated from the Luhansk region. Earlier, the UN's humanitarian coordinator in Ukraine, Osnat Lubrani, had said that, quote, guaranteed safe passage for civilians is crucial to allow humanitarian aid to reach those in need. Meanwhile, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says he has directed the body's humanitarian chief, Martin Griffiths, to explore with the parties involved the possibility of a humanitarian ceasefire in Ukraine. Speaking to reporters in New York, Mr. Guterres also appealed for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire to allow for progress in serious political negotiations to reach a peace agreement based on the principles of the United Nations Charter.
I've asked Martin Griffiths, the coordinator of our humanitarian work worldwide, immediately to explore with the parties involved the possible agreements and arrangements for a humanitarian ceasefire in Ukraine. Since the beginning of the Russian invasion 1 month ago, the war has led to the senseless loss of thousands of lives, the displacement of 10 million people, mainly women and children, the systematic destruction of essential infrastructure, and skyrocketing food and energy prices worldwide. This must stop. The United Nations is doing everything in its power to support people whose lives have been overturned by the war. In the past months, beyond their support to refugee hosting countries, our humanitarian agencies and their partners have reached nearly 900,000 people, mainly in eastern Ukraine, with food, shelter, blankets, medicine, bottled water, and hygiene supplies. There are now more than 1,000 United Nations personnel in the country, working via 8 humanitarian hubs in Dnipro, Vinnytsia, Lviv, Uzhhorod, Chernivtsi, Mukachevo, Luhansk, and Donetsk. The World Food Programme and partners reached 800,000 people in the past months and are scaling up to reach 1.2 million people by mid-April. The World Health Organization and partners have reached more than 500,000 people in the most vulnerable areas with emergency health, trauma, and surgery kits. Just today, a convoy of trucks brought food, medical, and other relief supplies from WFP, WHO, UNHCR, UNICEF to Kharkiv to be delivered by our national partners to thousands of people in hard-hit areas. Our agencies and partners are procuring vital supplies and setting up pipelines for deliveries throughout Ukraine in the coming weeks. But let's be clear. The solution to this humanitarian tragedy is not humanitarian. It is political. I'm therefore appealing for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire to allow for progress in serious political negotiations aiming at reaching a peace agreement based on the principles of the United Nations Charter. A cessation of hostilities will allow essential humanitarian aid to be delivered and enable civilians to move around safely. It will save lives, prevent suffering, and protect civilians. I hope a ceasefire will also help to address the global consequences of this war, which risks compounding the deep hunger crisis in many developing countries that already lack fiscal space to invest in their recovery from the pandemic and now face soaring food and energy costs. I strongly appeal to the parties to this conflict and to the international community as a whole to work with us for peace in solidarity with the people of Ukraine and across the world.
Let's talk now to David Otto, who joins us from the British capital, London. David, always a pleasure to see you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Let's talk about these peace talks. Some people have said talks about talks, but they're holding face-to-face for the first time. And from what analysts on ground in Istanbul, including Doreen Jones, have told us, it looks like both sides are feeling the pinch now, and that might appear to be what is needed to get both sides to make the necessary movements for peace. Is that your reading of the situation, knowing what's going on ground?
First of all, I think it's very early to make any determination as to what these talks for talks, or however we want to phrase them. How they're going. But of course, one would expect that on day 34 of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there will be talks going on. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky had an informal indication with some Russian journalists. Of course, this has not been published or allowed to be published in the Russian media, as I understand. I think one of the things that he indicated in that media discussion was that, of course, Ukraine is ready to be a neutral country. He also made it very clear that Ukraine, is also ready to consider some of the, separatist areas. But of course, one thing which was much more related to what Russia is asking for is that Ukraine gives that assurance that it will not become a member of NATO and that it will not neutralize, it will not have any nuclear capabilities. But these are just indications, and one of the caveats which the Ukrainian president made was that this has to go through some form of a referendum. And then, of course, Ukraine needs some level of security guarantees. So it's not just about having these talks. It's also about understanding what Russia is actually looking for. Again, as we always say, if you invade a country for one reason, which perhaps could be the fact that Ukraine, shouldn't be a member of NATO or contemplate joining NATO, now it has extended to the extent where Russia is asking for a complete demilitarization of Ukraine, a denazification of Ukraine, which perhaps it's not something on Ukraine's table at the moment. So yes, we're happy to see these talks taking place in Turkey. We are not sure how this is going to lead to anything concrete, because of course, as you know, and as the audience understand, it is not just about Ukraine and Russia. It's also about, what NATO allies and the United States, want to get out of this. So it's very early to determine.
Given the fact that, and that was what I was referring to when I talked earlier, all the points you've raised about what President Zelensky seems to be offering now or willing to consider, and then the Russians also admitting that they've taken quite a bit of a hit in terms of casualties and in terms of the economic costs and all of that. But step into the middle now is the Turkish president himself. The earlier talks that were held 2 weeks ago, he's kind of stayed back. But in this one, he's almost like personally involved. And from what we hear, this meeting is supposed to be a prelude, in his view, to a meeting between Presidents Putin and Zelensky themselves, face to face. Because in his view, he believes that only that kind of meeting can lead to the kind of decisions that are needed to bring an end to this. Is that for you a viable strategy, talking from the angles that we have been talking?
Yes, of course. I think one thing which Vladimir Putin, who is the Russian president, has made very clear is that he will only attend a face-to-face talk with his Ukrainian counterpart, Volodymyr Zelensky, if there are concrete, propositions, to put it that way, on the table. And perhaps this was indicative of, the statements that Volodymyr Zelensky made recently about the fact that they are ready to consider the neutrality of Ukraine, but of course that they are also ready to, ensure that Ukraine does not have any nuclear capability. But I don't know if this is what Russia will go for, and I don't think this may trigger Vladimir Putin meeting on the table, because of course some of the key things which Vladimir Putin has indicated to be, some sort of, grounds for face-to-face talks, as I mentioned earlier on, is the fact that he wants a complete independence of the Donbas region, especially the Luhansk and Donetsk. Of course, Crimea is already in the hands of Ukraine, of Russia, which was annexed in 2014. He also talked about, as I mentioned earlier on, that he wants a full demilitarization, denazification, which of course refers to the fact that Ukraine, according to Russians' version, is kind of ruled by pro-Nazis, and he thinks that this is having a very serious impact on the Russian natives within Ukraine. So, in other words, he indirectly wants some kind of a regime change within Ukraine, but he hasn't actually said that in principle. So we're still looking at some of these options, but I don't think the Russian president will go for these talks at this point in time. I think what we would say is, the Turkish president Recep Erdogan making some grounds, and then perhaps pulling Russia to come on the table. But it all depends on what both sides are ready to concede, because when it comes to negotiation, you have a position, but then you by going on the table, you're indicating that you're ready to shift your position. So let's see what really will make Russian President Putin to shift his position. Perhaps it could be again the fact that Ukraine is ready to be neutral. But the fact that Ukraine is saying that this is going to go through a referendum, it will make it very challenging, because then it tells us that this is going to take more time than we expect, because a referendum is not something that you just organize in a day or two. So we're still very unclear as to how this is going to work in practice.
When you talked about regime change, it brought to mind the statement from U.S. President Biden, and you talked about this not just being Russia and Ukraine. There are all these other parties who are involved, and the U.S. is one of them. In fact, the U.S. is probably the most powerful other party that is involved in this matter. And there have been indications, or there were indications, that President Biden may have been, signaling policy or talking about the fact that President Putin cannot be in power for much longer, even though he has clarified, and the White House has clarified, that that was not administration policy. It was the president speaking as a person about what he felt was going on. But do you think that kind of comment coming on the eve of these talks may have dropped a fly in the ointment, do you think?
I think it's very difficult for the US to argue in any way that this was a slip of the tongue. Usually, perhaps these conversations are had in private, and then, of course, the US president then had it, in public. They're now taking it back. But it's very difficult to see that such a statement could be a slip of the tongue. I would lean towards the fact that there is an interest, perhaps for the US, if there is a change in regime in Russia. Of course, if you look at the practicalities, for example, all the economic sanctions that are being levied on Russia, one of the impact of that is perhaps to drive in a revolution, which will then, unsettle Crimea. And of course, that, practical intervention, would indicate to you and to anyone that, there is that appetite for regime change. But I'm very, uncertain that that will be achieved. I mean, we saw the same thing happening with Syria, and Russia was the main blocker of the regime change in the case of Syria. So, those kind of statements being made, I think, it makes the situation much more complex. And it therefore opens the thought of many that, again, this is not just a war between Ukraine and Russia on the basis of, being a member of NATO. This is, an extension of the Cold War between Russia, NATO, and the United States. So, it's revealed, and it keeps revealing that, this is much more of a proxy war rather than, a war between Russia and Ukraine. And perhaps that is why Ukraine may have realized that, for the betterment of its citizens and its infrastructure, it may be much more practical and useful at this point to engage in a negotiation with Russia, because, of course, this is going to drag on, and the person who pays the biggest price would be Ukraine and no one else.
That's it. Thank you so very much, David Otto, for your time this morning, as always, for the perspective. David Otto joins us from London, the British capital. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's talk to business now. Over a month after Russia invaded Ukraine, corporates are still exiting Russia. The latest European brewers, Heineken and Carlsberg. Heineken had already halted new investments and exports to Russia and had stopped the sale, production, and advertising of its Heineken brand of beer in the country. Carlsberg's Russian business reported revenue and operating profit of 6.5 billion Danish kroner. That's about $958 million, and 682 million kroner, that's about $100 million, respectively, in 2021. So, as always, let's talk to Ini John McGuire. Ini, morning.
Good morning.
So, more companies still leaving. So, even though there are peace talks, there's this also continuing to happen. The let-up on the squeeze economically is not happening.
Yes, well, according to Heineken, one of their major reasons for doing this, in spite of the peace talks, like you noted, is they want to register that they are really not in support, or totally not in support of what Russia, the step that Russia has taken, of course, invading Ukraine and the consequences that have followed. But, unlike the other corporates that were just left, they have this Carlsberg's Denmark and all that, they have a more stable strategy. So, for instance, Carlsberg is going to pay about 1,800 of its staff. It's going to be paying them salary until the end of the year. And then they're also looking for locals who can buy up, their property. So they are still operating limited, at this time. Heineken is, of course, they don't really...
They are not taking this
and they are losing, they lost a lot of money, hundreds of millions of dollars they have lost by this. But they are saying that the essence of this is to register their stance that they are not in support and they are not happy with the step that Russia has taken. So, I mean, it cost them something, but this is the price that they are ready to pay, to make their stance known.
International Monetary Fund is weighing in on shipping costs.
Yes.
Because, I think someone said during one of our shows this week already, saying that, look, the costs have gone up. insurance costs, freight costs, all the associated costs.
And you know, we talked about the Black Sea yesterday and talked about the disruption there. 80% of international goods are shipped on the sea. So now with what's happening there, and you have this giant, you know, we talked about 5 or 6 countries using the Black Sea. So, I mean, if those countries who are major exporters of grain and some other products cannot easily do business on that sea, on that part of the ports, on the Black Sea, then we can only imagine. I mean, I know before the pandemic, this didn't start now, actually, according to the IMF. It started with COVID, yes. So before COVID, shipping across the Black Sea used to be about $2,000 for a container. It went up to $11,000, and so we're beginning to see a recovery. Went down to about $9,000, you know, just before the war. So at this time now, it's like we're going to the COVID, the height of the COVID, yes. So this, of course, will feed into disruption of supplies. Of course, when you don't have enough supply, then prices go up. And we're talking of inflation all over the world now. So this is what IMF is warning against, that this is going to further increase inflation in different countries, and countries are going to get desperate to deal with that, hiking interest rates and less liquidity in the system for
What's
people.
This about good relief for Ukrainian jobs?
Yes, so I mean, a bit of good news. We know that about 3 million, I know you always talk about it, Ukrainians have fled, you know, from their country home now. So, and they've gone to different countries, but they can't go there and be refugees or wait to be fed on. So corporates are doing something really beautiful. They are cutting away all the red tape and bureaucracy that they need. If you want to get a job, for instance, you need to bring paperwork, you need to have experience. So they are cutting away all of that to give these Ukrainians a soft landing for them to get a job. I know, for instance, in Poland, when you get to the border, you get a SIM card, you get a paper that allows you to register where you want to work or the kind of work you want to do. So that's what corporates are doing, especially in the European countries, the neighboring countries, to make it easier for them to at least live a normal life, even if it's in the short term.
And Nigeria is to supply gas to Europe. I'm reading that, but I want you to confirm that that is absolutely correct.
Well, what happened is the Minister of State for Petroleum is asking, you know, the corporates in the oil and gas industry, the ENI, the Shell and all that, to increase their investment, you know, in order to be able to meet up with it. But the sad thing is now, there's something we need to know. Nigeria is more of a gas country than an oil country. Nigeria has about 900 times the amount of oil. We have it in gas, but because we have not explored it, so you can imagine what Nigeria could have been earning at this time. Now, the good thing, well, to an extent, is there are some pipeline projects that are ongoing, but they are not completed yet. So that means Nigeria cannot make the most of this time. We have NNLG that can transport gas, you know, via vessel, you know, but that's just NNLG, you know, and then we have the reserve still there. Nigeria is has the 9th largest gas reserve in the world. So, I mean, there's so much that is left untapped there that we could have been using. And analysts say that over time, we haven't had investments in that area. And then government policy has not been encouraging, for instance. That's why you have a lot of flaring.
Absolutely.
PwC said we lost over $300 million. You know, 2018, to flaring, you know. So you can imagine if we captured all that was being flared and then we fed it at this time, Algeria is paying their jobless guys now because of what they have done, you know, in the oil and gas industry, making the most at this time.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, we're missing out a lot, and we hope that with this, there'll be investment, especially in the gas industry. And, you know, it will also give you clean energy.
Don't get me started, because I know that situation could have us talking for quite a while. But Ini, thank you for
Thank
this.
you for having me.
There'll be further details of all those stories in Business Morning and Business Incorporated right after this show, and then later on at 1:30 in the afternoon. But we'll take a break now, and when we come back, we'll be talking about wealthy Russians seeking financial haven in the wake of Moscow's invasion of Ukraine and Western sanctions. Please stay with us. Thanks for staying tuned. Wealthy Russians are pouring money into real estate in Turkey and the United Arab Emirates, seeking a financial haven in the wake of Moscow's invasion of Ukraine and Western sanctions, and that's according to many of the property companies. Sanctions imposed since the February 24th invasion include Russia's exclusion from the SWIFT banking system and the targeting of individuals such as oligarchs deemed to be close to President Vladimir Putin. While Turkey and the United Arab Emirates have criticized the Russian offensive, Ankara opposes non-UN sanctions on Russia, and both countries have relatively good ties with Moscow and still operate direct flights, potentially offering routes out for Russians and their cash.
Expo started coming to an end, and everybody was expecting the market to slow down as well. And then the Russian crisis started. So that was a new boost in the market. Not only the Russians, but it helped, I wouldn't say help, but was an incentive for Europeans also keep coming to Dubai. Right? The Russians are already used to Dubai. They just kept coming more. Yeah, obviously the number of Russians who get interested in the market here now is much more than, I would say, 2 months ago or 3 months ago. Right in the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine, we launched a campaign in the region, and the number of people that contacted us, it was, I would say, at least 10 times higher than it usually would be for such type of campaign. If you buy 750,000 dirhams worth of real estate, you get automatically the right to apply for a residence visa, and that would be for 3 years, renewable as long as you keep the property. We have other types of visas that are going to increase depending on the amount that you invest. If you invest 5 million dirhams, you would be able to apply for a 5-year visa, renewable as well. So that's definitely a big incentive. As I said, not just Russians, but Europeans and any other nationality.
And as war rages in Ukraine, impacting global food and fuel prices, citizens in Tunisia are wandering between empty supermarket shelves and bread queues amidst a deepening political and financial crisis impacting the country. Tunisia is headed for default if the current deterioration in its finances continues. Investment bank Morgan Stanley warns the country, which subsidizes domestic fuel prices and some foodstuff, was already seeking a foreign rescue package before the war in Ukraine led to jumps in global prices of certain commodities.
58-year-old Lofty Ajmi has been running a small bakery shop in the Tunisian capital for 20 years and says he can no longer find flour or semolina to bake bread, which has severely impacted his sales.
It's affected us so much, the war in Ukraine, that we can no longer work. Before this war, I could secure semolina every day in the range of 50 or 60 kilograms and make bread. With the war, we could no longer find even a little of the semolina for us to work. This is a big crisis.
The crisis forced the father of 3 to close his shop for 2 weeks as he could not secure flour. He only worked for 13 days this month. Tunisia faces a political and economic crisis as President Kais Saied focuses on rewriting the constitution after instituting one-man rule despite warnings of imminent collapse in public finances that threaten national bankruptcy. Economic analyst Ridha Chikandeli says the conflict in Ukraine has 3 repercussions on the country.
There are financial repercussions on the trade deficit because the cost of importing oil and grain has risen, and these will lead to a decline in the value of the Tunisian dinar and have inflationary repercussions.
A small team of IMF staff visited Tunisia last week for further discussions about a possible IMF-supported finance program. Nevertheless, Tunisia's powerful UGTT union informed the delegation that it rejected the government's reform proposals, especially lifting subsidies and freezing wages and hiring. An IMF deal is seen as vital to unlock other possible bilateral financial assistance from donors that have repeatedly bailed out Tunisia over recent years.
Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba is advising anyone going for negotiations with the Russian Federation not to eat or drink anything, before adding that everyone is thirsty for news, for sensations. He was speaking on national television, and this may not be unconnected with reports that Russian oligarch Roman Abramovich was poisoned during negotiations to help end the Russian invasion of Ukraine. According to the Wall Street Journal and the investigative outlet Bellingcat, Mr. Abramovich and Ukrainian peace negotiators suffered symptoms of suspected poisoning earlier this month after a meeting in Kiev. The Wall Street Journal report said Mr. Abramovich, who accepted Ukrainian requests to help negotiate an end to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and at least 2 senior members of the Ukrainian team had been affected. Their symptoms were reported to include red eyes, constant and painful tearing and peeling skin on their faces and hands. The Wall Street Journal also reported that Mr. Abramovich and the Ukrainian negotiators, including Crimean Tatar lawmaker Rustem Umerov, have since improved and their lives were not in danger. The Kremlin has said Mr. Abramovich played an early role in peace talks between Russia and Ukraine, but the process was now in the hands of the 2 sides' negotiating teams. The question of what he was doing in Kiev, that's Mr. Abramovich, in the first week of March remains unanswered. And finally, a sign on the entrance of Ann's Bakery and Deli in Chicago's Ukrainian Community Village reads, "Ann's Bakery no longer supplies Russian-made products." The Ukrainian-owned grocery store, well known in the Midwestern part of the United States for its shelves stocked full of Eastern European food items, got rid of all Russian-made products. The shop owner, Vladimir Serich, believes putting his patriotism over profits is what's important as his own country wages war against Russia. The store is replacing the holes left behind by the removal of the Russian items with products from Ukraine and Poland.
We spent 2 days to remove all Russian stuff from the shelf. So right now you cannot find anything. Over here it's some waters. And this is some kind of waters which need the cooler all the way. And here we have like coffee, the food which doesn't require refrigeration. Some people are against what I'm doing, but what can I do, you know? But a lot of people support me, support Ukrainian. I support Ukrainian military. So I'm doing whatever I can do. They complain, but I'm ignoring because I cannot satisfy everybody, you know. I'm not selling Russia because, you know, I'm Ukrainian guy. I'm patriot. So I don't want to sell Russian stuff. I support Ukraine. If I will sell Russian stuff, it's me I support the Russia. I don't want to support the Russia. I'm fighting for my country, for my people, for Ukrainian, not for Russia. That's the basic reason.
Deep sentiments, and it's on that note that we end this morning's program. Do join us for an update at 5 later on in the day. The show will be back tomorrow at 9 in the morning. I'm Ladi Akere. Do have yourselves a good day ahead.